There is a particular quality to silence in deep space, not the silence of emptiness. Space is never truly empty, but the silence of things that refuse to be spoken, the silence of records sealed behind bureaucratic stone, the silence of a galaxy that learned, long ago, that certain truths are more dangerous than any weapon. The Velthari Dominion had held its corner of the Orion Arm for 400 years. By galactic reckoning, this made them adolescents. By their own reckoning, it made them eternal. Their 7 core worlds burned with the light of engineered suns. Their trade fleets moved through 11 sectors like blood through a healthy body. Their academies produced philosophers, engineers, artists, and historians. Always historians. Because the Veltari believed that a civilization which understood its own past was a civilization that could not be surprised by its future. They were wrong about that. In the older reaches of the galaxy, among the species who had watched empires rise and dissolve like morning frost, there were whispered names. Species that should not be provoked. Forces that, once set in motion, did not stop until the mathematics of justice reached their final sum. The Keth ancients called them the unbowed. The Sorathi collective had 17 words for them across 17 dialects, and every single one translated at its root to the same concept: those who return. Humanity. 300 years before the story begins, the human species had been vibrant, numerous, and expanding. They occupied 11 colony worlds and 1 home planet, a blue-green jewel called Earth, orbiting an ordinary yellow star. They had music that made other species weep without understanding why. They had a concept, untranslatable, though many tried, called stubbornness, which was really just love wearing armor. And then, in the span of 2 Velthari administrative cycles, they were gone. Not extinct. The Velthari records were careful about that word. Careful in the way that a murderer is careful not to say the precise word that would convict them. The humans were simply redistributed, integrated. Their worlds were repurposed for Veltari colonial expansion. Their labor built the infrastructure of the Dominion's golden age. Their art was absorbed without attribution. Their names were removed from the star charts. The galaxy noticed. The galaxy said nothing. This too is a form of complicity. But archives do not lie. They can be sealed. They can be suppressed. They can be buried beneath 3 centuries of careful administrative sediment. However, data does not forget. Numbers do not negotiate. And somewhere in the deepest vaults of the Velthari Historical Preservation Institute on the world of Vel Prime, the truth waited, patient as starlight, for someone young enough and honest enough to look directly at it. Her name was Thessaly Vore. She was 26 years old. She had no idea what she was about to find. And far away, in the dark between stars, other eyes were already watching her. Vel Prime was beautiful in the way that things built on stolen foundations are beautiful, completely and without apology. Its capital, Vel Sorin, rose from plains of engineered amber grass in towers of pale mineral composite that caught the light of its twin moons and scattered it like broken promises. The Dominion's grand convocation met in a chamber whose ceiling depicted the Velthari founding, the so-called Age of Expansion, rendered in luminescent fresco, showing Velthari explorers striding across empty worlds, hands outstretched toward unclaimed stars. Empty worlds. That was always how the fresco showed them. Empty. Archivector Marin Solve was 63 years old and had spent 4 decades ensuring the fresco story was the only story. Not through crude destruction, the Velthari were sophisticated, but through the far more elegant tool of administrative irrelevance. Records were not deleted, they were simply recategorized, cross-referenced into obscurity, filed under headings no researcher would think to search. The truth was not hidden. It was merely made inconvenient. Solve stood at the window of the Institute's seventh administrative tier and watched the junior researchers moving through the atrium below, like careful fish in a formal pond. His gaze settled briefly on Thessaly Vore. She was exceptional. Everyone said so, which was precisely why he had assigned her the Labor Migration Studies project. It was a controlled pasture, important sounding, thoroughly mapped, all the interesting questions pre-answered. He had no particular concern. The Dominion Council met that same afternoon to discuss the human remnant question, as they called it, the approximately 11 million humans still registered as Velthari-administered laborers, now technically citizens under the Recategorization Act of 60 years ago, though citizenship and equality remained distinct concepts in Velthari law. The Council's position was consistent. The matter was historical. The affected parties had been compensated through integration, and continued discussion served only to agitate populations that had been, as one counselor phrased it, with magnificent delicacy, successfully stabilized. No one on the council had spoken to a human in years. This they considered evidence of successful integration. In the private lounges of the Upper Institute, senior historians drank pale fermented grain spirits and spoke of humanity the way old men speak of a fire they once watched from a safe distance, with vague interest and the comfortable certainty that it had burned itself out. 3 centuries was a long time. 3 centuries was long enough for a species to forget itself, to lose its language, to let its wounds scar over and become simply the shape of it. That was what the Velthari believed, that time heals wounds the same way it heals everything, by covering them. They did not understand that some species heal differently, that some species carry their wounds the way a river carries a stone, smoothing it, yes, but also being shaped by it, directed by it, given purpose by the weight of it. They had never studied humanity closely enough to understand that the most dangerous thing you can do to such a people is teach their children that their suffering did not happen. The Sully Vore was at that moment 3 levels below, opening a file that had not been opened in 60 years. The warning came from the Sorathi. This was not surprising. The Sorathi were very old, older than the Velthari Dominion by a factor of 8, and they had the particular habit of ancient species, which is to say they appeared at inconvenient moments bearing inconvenient truths, and then vanished before anyone could argue with them effectively. Sorathi Ambassador Queeth arrived at Vel Soran without prior notice, which was itself a message, since the Sorathi understood protocol perfectly and chose when to observe it with surgical precision. She was received by Archivector Solve in a formal reception hall because the council considered her visit a matter of historical affairs, not diplomatic urgency. This was their first mistake. Queeth was 340 years old. She had been 40 years old when the Velthari labor acquisition program began. She had watched it happen. She had filed formal objections through 17 separate Sorathi diplomatic channels, all of which had been received, acknowledged, and administratively interred alongside the records they concerned. She sat across from Solve and spoke without preamble. "You have a researcher," she said. "Young, thorough. She has found the edge of what you buried. She will find the rest within 30 days. Solve offered her fermented grain spirit. She declined. He smiled the smile of a man who has maintained a comfortable fiction for so long that he has confused it with reality. "Our archival systems are quite comprehensive," he said. "Junior researchers operate within appropriate research parameters." "She has found the Kareth annexation shipping manifests," Queeth said. "The ones that list human beings under cargo classification 7D, perishable biological units. Destination, Velthari Colonial Infrastructure Projects." The smile did not leave Solve's face, but it changed, calcified. An interesting historical artifact? Context is everything in archival work. "I am not here about the records," Queeth said quietly. "I am here about the humans." She let that settle for a moment. They know. They have always known. For 300 years, they have been waiting to see whether your civilization would find its own conscience. There is a threshold, Archivector. I do not know its precise coordinates, but I know that the humans have been measuring the distance to it for a very long time. And I believe your researcher has just handed them a new data point. The humans are citizens, Solve said. Integrated, stabilized. You keep using that word, Queth said. She stood, which meant the meeting was over. The Sarathi decided such things unilaterally. Stabilized. As though a species were a weather system. As though you had calmed them. She paused at the door. You did not calm them, Archivector. You gave them 300 years to prepare. She left. Saul filed a report describing the meeting as a routine diplomatic consultation with no actionable findings. He genuinely believed this. That was his last mistake born of comfort. The ones that followed would be born of panic. The Sali Vor, 31 levels below, had just cross-referenced the shipping manifests against planetary census records and found a gap of 32 million souls. The file was called Labor Migration Administrative Survey, Kareth Sector, Cycles 1 through 40. It had been filed under a heading so generic that it appeared in over 9,000 separate archival categories, which meant it appeared, effectively, in none. Finding it had required Thessaly to develop a new cross-referencing algorithm, the kind of elegant lateral thinking that had made her professors describe her as troublingly good at her work. She opened it at the 3rd hour of the night cycle, when the institute was quiet and the atrium lights had dimmed to their amber minimum. She read for 6 hours without moving. The documents were dry. Administrative language is always dry because the people who write it understand instinctively that the driest language is the hardest to feel. Cargo manifests, transfer orders, resource allocation tables. But Thessaly had been trained to read what numbers meant, and what these numbers meant was this. In cycles 7 through 34 of the Velthari Dominion's expansion, approximately 32 million human beings had been transported from their home worlds to Velthari colonial construction projects. They were logged as Category 7D biological labor units. Their homeworlds were logged as cleared for resettlement. The humans themselves were logged as temporarily relocated, and then, in Cycle 34, they stopped being logged at all. Thessaly sat back from her console. Her hands were completely steady, which surprised her. She had expected to feel many things: shock, disbelief, the desperate urge to find the error in her analysis. Instead, she felt something cold and clarifying, like the moment a lens finally focuses. She pulled up the infrastructure records. The Vel Soran Towers, built cycles 8 through 15. The Dominion's primary trade relay network, constructed cycles 12 through 22. The great agricultural terraforming of the Kareth worlds, which the fresco in the Grand Convocation building depicted as Velthari hands reaching toward unclaimed stars, completed Cycle 31, using a labor force whose names did not appear in any official record, because they had been given cargo classifications instead of names. Except, the shipping manifests, in their compulsive administrative thoroughness, had included something the people who buried them had not thought to remove: the personal effects inventories. Category 7D, biological labor units were permitted, under Transport Regulation 14, to carry 2 kilograms of personal property. The inventories listed what they carried. A woman named Sarah Okafor had carried a hand-sewn blanket and a photograph. A man named Dmitry Volkov had carried a child's drawing sealed in a preservation sleeve. A girl, the manifest listed her age as 9, named Amara Santos, had carried a stuffed animal, a single book, and a folded piece of paper on which she had drawn, in a child's uncertain hand, a yellow star with a blue planet beside it. Thessaly pressed her hands flat against the console to stop them from shaking. They had stopped being steady. She understood now what she was looking at. Not a historical footnote, not a labor migration survey. A crime. The foundational crime of everything she had been taught to be proud of. She did not know yet that on 16 human vessels currently stationed at the edge of Velthari sensor range, quiet alert signals had just activated. She did not know that humans had placed deep archive monitoring threads into every major Velthari research system 30 years ago, watching for exactly this moment. She did not know that in a room she would never see, a human woman named Commander Yara Chen was reading the same document she was reading in real time and had just said quietly to the officers around her, "She found it. Start the clock." Thessaly spent the following 72 hours doing what thorough historians do when they suspect they have made a catastrophic discovery. She tried to prove herself wrong. She was not wrong. The further she dug, the more complete the picture became, with the horrible coherence of a truth that has been waiting rather than a lie that requires maintenance. Cross-referencing the labor manifests against colonial construction timelines, against the atmospheric processing records of 11 worlds that the Dominion called its greatest terraforming achievements, the math was immovable. The Velthari Golden Age, the century of expansion that every schoolchild learned as proof of Velthari ingenuity and civilizational virtue, had been built by human hands, by enslaved human hands, by people who had been stripped of their names, their worlds, their legal personhood, and finally, most damningly, their statistical existence. On the third day, she found the death records. They were not filed under death records. They were filed under biological unit attrition, infrastructure projects, category acceptable loss. She converted the percentages to absolute numbers using the workforce totals from the manifests. She sat with those numbers for a long time, 12,400,000, and some remainder she could not bring herself to calculate precisely. The Dominion had killed more than a third of the humans it had enslaved through overwork, malnutrition, and what the records described, with exquisite administrative blandness, as disciplinary incidents. Thessaly filed nothing. She told no one. She was 26 years old, and she understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that what she had found was not a matter of academic publication. It was a detonation waiting for a finger to touch it. She thought about Archivector Solve, who had mentored her, whose approval she had sought, whose careful hand she now recognized in the filing architecture that had almost, kept these records invisible. She thought about the Council. She thought about the 11 million humans currently living in Velthari space as second-class citizens, their history officially non-existent, their grief officially irrelevant, their very identity filtered through a system built on the erasure of their ancestors. And she thought about something she had heard, once, from an elderly human laborer in the agricultural district where she had done her preliminary field work. A man named Thomas Reyes, 71 years old, who tended heat crops in a field that 300 years ago had been a human colony world. He had said, unprompted, with a small and careful smile, "We tell our children everything. We have always told them everything. We just wait to see if your people will tell you first." She had not understood what he meant. She understood now. She pulled up a blank transmission form addressed to the Dominion Public Historical Record. Her cursor sat at the top of the document. Outside, the twin moons of Vel Prime rose over the amber plains, their light falling on towers built by hands the Dominion had tried to make into numbers. Somewhere in the dark between stars, 16 ships waited. A clock she could not see measured the distance between her hesitation and humanity's patience. She had not yet started typing, but she had not closed the document either. And somewhere, that was being noted. Commander Yara Chen had been patient for 9 days. This was not the patience of inaction. It was the patience of a river that has already chosen its course and is simply covering the remaining distance. She was 44 years old. Her grandmother had been born in a labor camp on the second Kareth colony world, in a prefabricated dormitory that the Velthari administrative records described as temporary worker accommodation. Unit 7, Kareth Terraforming Grid. Her grandmother had never seen Earth. She had seen photographs. Everyone had photographs, because the humans had been very deliberate about keeping photographs. And she had described it to Yara's mother, and Yara's mother had described it to Yara. A blue ocean, improbably vast, under a yellow sun that was ordinary and perfect, and theirs. Yara kept no photographs on the bridge of the UHCS Remembrance. She needed none. The ship's name was sufficient. 17 vessels, the entirety of the Human Compact's diplomatic and enforcement fleet, arranged in a formation that Velthari long-range sensors would read as a trade delegation. This was technically accurate. What was being traded, however, was not goods. The Compact had been established 80 years ago, recognized by the Dominion under the Recategorization Act as the formal administrative body for human citizens. The Dominion considered it a managed advocacy council. The Compact considered it something else entirely. The patient, methodical apparatus of an accounting that had been building interest for 300 years. On day 9, Thessaly Vore filed her report. It went simultaneously to the Dominion Public Historical Record, 17 independent galactic news networks, the Sorathi Diplomatic Archive, and the full membership roster of the Compact's Civilian Council. She had clearly spent several days on it. It was 240 pages long, exhaustively sourced, and written in the kind of precise, unflinching prose that comes from someone who has made their decision and will not be argued back from it. The Velthari Council's response arrived 4 hours later. The report had been flagged for administrative review. Researcher Vore had been placed on mandatory research leave pending an integrity audit. The Institute had issued a statement describing the document as preliminary analysis lacking appropriate context. Yara read the council's statement. She set it down. She turned to her communications officer. "Send the formal notification," she said. "Standard channel, diplomatic encryption." The message that arrived at the Velthari Council's secure terminal was 47 words long. It identified the sender as Commander Yara Chen, Human Compact Enforcement Division. It stated that the Compact had been monitoring Dominion archival systems for 30 years. It stated that it possessed complete copies of all records described in researcher Vore's report, plus additional materials not yet made public. It stated that the Compact was prepared to discuss a framework for formal acknowledgement, reparation, and historical correction. And it gave the Council one standard Velthari administrative cycle, 30 days, to respond. At the bottom, in plain text, without diplomatic ornamentation, it said, "We have been waiting 300 years. We can wait 30 more days, but not 31. Archivector Solve read the message and felt, for the first time in 40 years of comfortable certainty, something that he did not immediately have a word for. He found one eventually. It was an old word. The Velthari used it rarely, because they had spent centuries engineering their civilization specifically to avoid feeling it. Accountable. The Velthari Council spent the first 10 days of those 30 trying to find leverage. This was understandable. They were a civilization accustomed to the transactional architecture of power, where every party had something to protect, something to lose, and therefore something to negotiate with. They sent feelers to the Sorathi, carefully worded inquiries suggesting that Sorathi mediation might be welcomed, which was a polite way of asking the oldest civilization in the sector to please stand between them and the consequences of their history. Ambassador Queth's response was a single line: "The Sorathi do not mediate accountability." They tried economic pressure. The 11 million humans in Velthari space were, after 3 centuries, genuinely integrated into the labor economy of 8 worlds. Disrupting their status would hurt the Dominion nearly as much as the humans. The Compact's economists had clearly understood this for decades and had structured human economic participation accordingly. Yara Chen, when informed of this analysis, said nothing. She had known this for years. The Compact had been building these conditions carefully, quietly, for a very long time. They tried discrediting Thessaly Vor. The integrity audit found nothing, because there was nothing to find. She was 26, zealously principled, and the documentation she had submitted was so thoroughly sourced that attacking her methodology would require the council to engage with the underlying records, which was precisely what they wanted to avoid. On day 12, a junior council member named Priveth Sar made the mistake of suggesting, in a closed session, that the humans could simply be reclassified again, that the Compact's legal standing as a diplomatic body rested on dominion recognition, and that recognition could be withdrawn. The room went quiet in a specific way. Several of the older members were already doing the arithmetic. 17 ships in range, 30 years of documented intelligence gathering, a 30-day ultimatum with a hard edge that every person in that room instinctively understood was not rhetorical. Withdrawing recognition would not make the ships leave. It would make them change their offer. Thessaly Vor, technically on research leave, was spending her days in the public records section, compiling a secondary document, a social history, built from the personal effects inventories of who the enslaved humans had been. Not statistics, people. Sarah Okafor, who had carried a hand-sewn blanket, had been a marine biologist from a world whose oceans the Veltari had since drained for mineral processing. Dmitry Volkov, with his child's drawing in a preservation sleeve, had been an architectural engineer whose professional credentials were listed in the manifest alongside his cargo classification, a detail so casually cruel that Thessaly had to stop reading for an hour when she found it. Amara Santos, age 9, with her stuffed animal and her drawing of a yellow star. The manifest listed her final administrative status as biological unit attrition, acceptable loss, cycle 29. She had been 12 years old. Thessaly published the social history on day 14. She titled it simply, Their Names. It was read by 40 million people within 24 hours. By day 15, it had been translated into 67 languages, including the 6 primary dialects of the Sorothi and the trade lingua of every major species in the sector. The Velthari Council issued a statement expressing concern about inflammatory historical framing. No one paid any meaningful attention to the statement. Everyone was reading the names. On day 20, Yara Chen requested permission to address the Velthari Grand Convocation in person. The request was framed as a diplomatic courtesy. It was understood by everyone as something more formal than that. The council debated for 4 hours. Refusing the request would send a message that the compact could add to its already formidable public record. Accepting it would mean standing in that chamber beneath the fresco of empty worlds, while the person whose grandmother had been born in a labor camp on one of those worlds looked them in the eye. They accepted. The calculus of the lesser damage had become the primary mode of Velthari governance in the space of 3 weeks. Yara arrived with 3 aides and no weapons. She wore the uniform of the Human Compact Enforcement Division. Dark gray, minimal ornamentation, the Compact's insignia, a blue planet and a yellow star, hand-drawn, rendered in careful stitching. The style of a child's drawing, specifically chosen, specifically intentional. No one in the council chamber missed the reference. The social history. Their names had been read by everyone in that room. She stood at the speaker's lectern and looked up at the fresco before she spoke. The empty worlds. The Velthari hands reaching toward unclaimed stars. She looked at it for a long time, long enough that the silence became its own statement. Then she placed a data chip on the lectern. This contains the complete compact archive on the Karath enslavement, she said. Her voice was level, not angry. anger would have been easier for them to process. What she had was something far more difficult to navigate: clarity. 300 years of documentation, oral histories from every generation of human survivors, engineering assessments showing which specific structures in this dominion were built by enslaved human labor, death records, names. She paused. I want you to understand something. We have been prepared to present this material to every galactic authority for 30 years. We did not do so. We waited. We gave your civilization time to find its own conscience. We gave your researchers time to find the truth in your own archives. We considered it important that the acknowledgement come from within, that it be chosen, not compelled. Archive Vector Solve, seated in the third tier, found that he could not maintain eye contact with her. He was not certain why. He had managed far more aggressive negotiations without difficulty. There was something about her stillness that made evasion feel like a physical act and exhausting. Researcher Vore chose correctly, Yara said. We would like to acknowledge that, and now the Dominion must choose. The compact's requirements are in the documentation: formal acknowledgement, a comprehensive reparations framework, restoration of human history in all educational and archival systems, and the immediate elevation of human citizens to full legal equality without qualification. She looked around the chamber. These are not punitive demands. They are the minimum that justice requires. She picked up the data chip. You have 10 days remaining. My grandmother was born in a camp on Kareth too. She never saw Earth. I have never seen Earth. My children will see Earth. We found a world in the years your empire had us looking elsewhere that we have quietly been preparing for 3 generations. We do not need your permission to go home, but justice requires that you acknowledge how we were taken from it. On the 28th day, Archivector Marin Solve resigned from the Velthari Historical Preservation Institute. He did not make a statement. He submitted his resignation through standard administrative channels, citing personal reasons, and on the same day, delivered to Thessaly Vore's research terminal his complete personal archive: 40 years of deliberate concealment, documented in his own hand, cataloged and cross-referenced with the institutional precision of a man who understood that thoroughness in burying a thing requires the same rigor as thoroughness in finding it. Whether this was conscience or calculation, an attempt to control the narrative of his own culpability, Thessaly never determined. She accepted the archive. She published all of it. On the 29th day, the Velthari Grand Convocation voted. The result was not unanimous: 41 votes in favor of accepting the compact's framework, 19 against, 7 abstentions, which in this context meant the same as against, but with better positioning for future revisionism. The 41 were enough. The convocation's formal statement of acknowledgement, drafted over 72 consecutive hours by a committee that included 2 human compact liaisons and Thessaly Vore, still technically on research leave, was 33 pages long. It used none of the administrative euphemisms. It said enslavement. It said systematic. It said murder, in the specific context of the attrition records. It said that these things had been done in the name of the Velthari Dominion, and that the Dominion acknowledged them, without qualification. Yara Chen read the statement aboard the Remembrance. She read it from the beginning to the end. Then she set it down and sat quietly for several minutes, while her crew maintained a respectful silence. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 28 years old, who had grown up on one of the compact's deep space habitats and had never known a planetary surface, watched his commander and did not intrude on whatever was happening in that silence. He understood, without needing it explained, that this was not victory. It was not celebration. It was the closing of an account that had been open since before his grandmother's grandmother was born. Not the end of grief, but the beginning of its acknowledgement. Yara looked up eventually. "Inform the fleet," she said, and send confirmation to the Compact Council. Full acknowledgement. Unconditional. She paused. And send a message to researcher Vor. Personal. Unencrypted. The message said, "Thank you for choosing. 300 years ago, no one chose. You did. The names you published. Their families will know that someone in the place that erased them looked at what was done and refused to look away. That matters, more than you know." In the Grand Convocation Chamber, workers had already begun the slow process of correcting the fresco, not destroying it. Thessaly had argued against destruction, because a destroyed fresco teaches nothing. Instead, into the empty worlds that Velthari hands reached toward, small figures were being carefully added. Human figures, workers, families, children, people, not cargo. The original fresco would remain visible beneath them, its lie now documented in the art itself, a permanent record of both the crime and the correction. The galaxy watched this. The galaxy, for the first time in 300 years on this particular subject, did not stay silent. 6 months after the convocation vote, Sorathi Ambassador Queeth gave an address to the Galactic Compact of Species, the loose confederacy of elder races that served, in times of civilizational consequence, as something like a conscience. She was asked to speak specifically about the human question, because 7 species had submitted diplomatic inquiries to the Sorathi in the preceding months, all of them containing, in various phrasings, the same essential concern. What precisely were the humans? And what did this mean for everyone else? Queeth spoke for 40 minutes. The address was recorded and distributed to every member species. The relevant section read as follows: "There is a persistent misunderstanding about humanity that I would like to correct. Many species characterize them as aggressive, as warlike, as dangerous. This is imprecise. Humans are not uniquely prone to violence. They are uniquely prone to something else, which is the thing that makes them worth understanding carefully. Call it consequence. Call it accounting. They maintain, across generations, across centuries, across whatever distance you force between them and their history, an absolute and unbroken record of what was done to them and by whom. They do not rage. They do not escalate. They wait with a patience that should alarm you precisely because it does not look like patience. It looks like ordinary life, ordinary people going about ordinary things, and underneath it, always, the ledger." She paused in the recording. They gave the Velthari 300 years. They watched and waited while their people were enslaved, and their worlds were taken, and their names were replaced with cargo classifications. They did not attack. They did not surrender. They built. They remembered. They told their children, and their children's children, exactly what had happened, exactly who had done it, and exactly what justice would eventually require. And then they waited for the Velthari to find the courage to look at themselves. What should you take from this? Not fear, though I understand the impulse. Take instead precision. Do not harm them. Do not erase them. Do not decide, for the comfort of your expansion or the tidiness of your history, that their lives are resources to be used, and their memories are inconveniences to be managed. They will not forget. They will not forgive in the way that means moving on without resolution. But they do understand justice, real justice, the kind that requires acknowledgement, not just cessation. The Velthari chose in the end to reckon with what they had done, not because they were forced. The Compact's fleet was 17 ships, which could not have threatened the Dominion militarily. They chose because a young historian read the names of the people her civilization had erased and found that she could not unknow them. That is the mechanism the humans rely on. Not firepower, memory. The unburiable weight of human memory, and the bet, the 300-year bet, that somewhere in any civilization, There is someone honest enough to look at a child's drawing of a yellow star and understand that the child who drew it had a name and a life, and people who loved her, and that no administrative category in any language, in any civilization, in all the long history of the galaxy, can make that not true. She concluded, "Do not make them wait. The patience of the humans is not a mercy. It is a measuring tool. And it is very, very accurate." Thessaly Vore heard the address in her new office. She had been appointed to chair the newly established Dominion Compact Historical Reconciliation Commission, the first human Velthari joint institution in 3 centuries. She listened to the whole thing. When it finished, she sat for a while in the particular silence that follows the precise naming of a thing that has been true all along. Then she opened the next file and continued the work of ensuring that every name was returned to the record where it belonged, not as cargo, as people, as the irreducible, indestructible 300-year patient truth that archives in the end will always tell.